Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to be here. If I haven't had the chance to meet you yet, my name is Brett Cease. I serve as CCL's Vice President of Field Operations. I use he, him pronouns, and it's so wonderful to be here together with over 1,000 attendees, including almost 100 watch parties gathering today. I don't have to say this, but I do want to remind everyone that you are our most engaged volunteers who give CCL its energy, its resilience, its reputation for showing up with respect and purpose in each and every one of our lobby meetings that we'll be hosting next week virtually. Thanks for all the hearts and support here in the chat. In a couple of minutes, I'll actually be interviewing Dr. Sena Koleva, a leading researcher in moral psychology, for an extended Q&A. And I'm really looking forward to this because Dr. Koleva's work connects directly to some of the most important concepts in what I'm about to introduce, and she's going to help bring those ideas to life. But before we dive in, I do actually want to share something exciting about today's session, and that's this. Our field operations team has been hard at work on something that we are really excited to share with you today. It's something we'll be rolling out that you heard from Ricky starting early next year in January, but today is our first sneak peek, so da da da. We would like to tell you a little bit more about the Bridge program. Now, it stands for Building Relationships in Dialogue, Growth, and Engagement, hence the Bridge acronym, Building Relationships in Dialogue, Growth, and Engagement. And this program isn't launching today, it's not live yet, but we want you, our most engaged volunteers, to be the first to see where we're heading. So let's dive in. Why Bridge and why is it practical? Well, we already all know this, and that is that facts alone don't move Congress. Charts and talking points don't build bipartisan coalitions, and brilliant policy design doesn't really matter if the political system isn't ready to receive it. What does move Congress and what has always moved Congress is trust, as we've already heard from our other speakers today. Trusted messengers, trusted relationships, trusted networks of people who understand each other, who speak the same moral language, and find common purpose even when they don't agree on everything. So the success of our lobby meetings rarely comes down to the perfect statistic or the ideal policy pitch. It comes down to trust and to that connection and to whether the person you're talking to feels understood and respected. That's really the heart of the Bridge program as well. And our team has been studying the latest in social science, from moral foundations theory to audience research to motivational interviewing to network science. And we keep seeing the same message again and again that durable political change comes from durable human relationships. So that's not new for CCL. That's who we've always been, right? But Bridge is going to help us do our relational advocacy with more precision, with more confidence, and with more impact. And everything in Bridge is designed to help make climate conversations feel more grounded and more effective for each of us. So, Bridge isn't going to be a theory for theory's sake. Instead, it's going to be a lesson by lesson plan that gives you practical tools you can use immediately in your own relationships, whether that's with your member of Congress, their staff, community members, grass tops leaders, family members, people in your chapter, you name it. So let me be clear, it's not going to be another communications training or a list of clever phrases to memorize before, your next lobby day. Instead, what it's really going to dive into is a developmental pathway, a formation process, if you will, over a 9 lesson curriculum built around 3 essential capacities that are going to help each of us as CCL volunteers in your climate leadership. Number one, having the chance to understand people's deepest moral motivations. Why is it that we instinctively respond to some messages and reject others? Have you ever wondered? Why do smart, kind people see climate solutions so differently? And how can we communicate in ways that respect, not override others' identities? We'll also explore number two, knowing your audience with strategic precision. Who actually influences your member of Congress? What cultural values shape your district? What influences and pressures and incentives drive your member of Congress's decisions? And how do you build a partnership with them to advance policy solutions? And number three, guiding meaningful conversations that build trust. How do we engage in conversations that aren't about winning, but actually about listening, that aren't about persuasion, but are about partnership, that aren't about changing minds, but instead about building that kind of durable social norm that can turn climate action into, from a political liability into a political advantage. So you might be curious, what do these actually look like? Let's preview those three parts. We'll have the chance to talk through each of these. Number one, understanding people's moral motivations. This section is going to focus on helping you recognize the deeper values shaping somebody's reactions. You'll learn how to hear what values someone is expressing, reduce your own defensiveness, speak in ways that resonate with different worldviews, and keep conversations constructive, even if they're challenging. Volunteers who are helping us pilot this have already shared it's improved not only their preparations for lobby meetings, but all of their climate conversations. Then we're going to dive into part two, knowing your audience with more precision. This part shows you how to understand your member of Congress, not just hypothetically, but practically. What committees matter for them, who influences them locally, what cultural forces shape their choices, and how your community looks from their perspective. These tools will help your team design messages and meetings that land where they need to. And three, last but not least, guiding those meaningful conversations that can help build and enhance that trust. Here, Bridge gives you hands-on conversational tools from motivational interviewing techniques to deep listening strategies to helping you think through what questions to ask to help open people up and to move the conversation forward collaboratively. These skills are going to help support productive conversations in lobby meetings, in community events, and in chapter leadership. So, why does this really matter for you? Well, every volunteer that's here today, that's listening to the recording later, that's going to dive into the program next year, has the opportunity to help set the tone for your chapter and contribute to building meaningful relationships in your community and with Congress. Bridge is going to be designed to help your chapter build a culture of relational advocacy, support volunteers in developing their own deeper skills, foster conversations that build trust and momentum, and really create deeper, more meaningful, and more effective engagement with your member of Congress. Now, this isn't a training to check off. It's going to be a practical set of tools to use in real relationships and in real conversations. So let's look ahead a little bit. What's coming in January? Beginning early next year, Bridge will roll out, you'll see, in several formats. We'll have self-paced online lessons available. We'll be featuring it in our monthly volunteer leadership calls. We'll make sure to provide facilitator-ready exercises for our chapters throughout the year. And we'll also make sure to make these tools available for audience research and outreach more accessible. So today isn't about launching Bridge. It's about helping you feel more excited and ready to roll this out next year with us. Today, we're actually going to be diving in to that most important foundation of part one, moral foundations theory. And we didn't want to introduce it without giving you the chance to really explore it before anything else. So we're actually lucky to have the amazing Dr. Sena Koleva with us, one of the early researchers in this field. Dr. Koleva literally co-wrote the website yourmorals.org that we'll be drawing from next year that helps us understand how people form moral intuitions, why we respond differently to the same issues, and what it takes to connect across divides. So, for the next 50 minutes, she and I are going to have the chance to talk through how values shape reactions to climate policy, why certain messages resonate with some audiences and not others, how to apply these insights to your relationships with Congress. And, this conversation rather, is really meant to bring the science behind Bridge Part 1 to life, to give you a deeper understanding of how these tools will support your work as climate leaders next year and beyond. And we're also going to make sure to save the final 15 minutes of our hour together for more audience questions. So feel free, as you are apt to do as amazing question askers across the country, to start putting those into the Q&A box. And with that, please join me in welcoming the amazing Dr. Sena Koleva. So if you'll oblige me, I actually would love to just briefly answer to give a little bit more background, Dr. Koleva, about your own background before we dive in. And this is just to help know a little bit more about you. Your prior work includes being head of user insights at academia.edu, where in addition to other accomplishments, you led cross-functional teams that served over 300 million users. You also served as the research director at Sea Change Institute to understand the human component of climate change and sustainability. as well as the co-founder and chief scientist at Character.io. And I know, at least for me, these are all impressive in their own right. But, again, as I've said, perhaps more than anything, our volunteers are going to love to learn that you are one of the creators of yourmorals.org, which is really one of the first large websites for psychology research. And without any marketing or funding, you built a community of millions of users who have given us data to cross-reference across psychological questionnaires and web experiments that you'll maybe give us a bit more of a preview in today. But that's really led to dozens of scientific papers cited tens of thousands of times, as well as being featured in your collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Haidt's New York Times bestseller, The Righteous Mind. So we'll get to exploring your morals in just a bit. But to start things out, just to help us know a little bit more about our own speakers and your own personal story, would you be okay with starting with just learning more about what first led you to study moral psychology?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. I'm really, really excited to be here and with everyone. Um, I learned about moral foundations theory through a conference, our annual organizations conference. I had already gotten interested in morality by studying this interesting theory I stumbled upon on how being reminded of our mortality, that is, we know as humans, unlike other animals, that we're going to die. And so there's this dread that's caused inside of us. Probably everyone here with us is suddenly feeling, oh, why is she talking about dying? But that spurs people into really wanting to see themselves as good and moral and really wanting to see their world as good and moral. And so I was already interested in morality. So I went to this morality talk at our annual conference. And it was this amazing talk I'll never forget by Dr. Jonathan Haidt talking about moral foundations theory. I thought this was the most interesting thing I'd heard. This was, I think, my second year in graduate school. And I ran to my advisor and was like, oh my God, I really want to use their questionnaire. I think this is so cool. And he was like, just contact them and ask them. And I was like, what do you mean, contact the person that I just saw on stage? But I did. And we hit it off. I started collaborating with his lab. And this was the most rich and fun collaboration I've had in my career. So that's how I got involved with moral foundations theory.
I love it. And how accessible, right? That's kind of what you hope for with any kind of grad student, just being able to walk right up and get to
Yeah.
know the researchers leading the field.
Hmm.
Well, I guess, let's zoom back out a little bit. And for those that might be new to moral foundations theory or just hearing about it today or on the recording, how do you like to explain it?
Yeah, sure. So moral foundations theory proposes that as humans, we have these innate, automatic, unconscious almost reactions of like good and bad when we encounter some socially relevant situation. So previously theories had said that we use these principles and this like we kind of like think through if something is right or wrong. And moral foundations theory was like, no, 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 this is all intuitive. This just arises. So I'm just going to give you some examples and kind of that try to illustrate that effect. So imagine that you're hanging out in a park, maybe with your child, and you see a mother and her child at the park, and the child's maybe 3 years old, looks well dressed, looks well taken care of, the mother, nothing originally to be concerned about. The child looks like they're okay, but the mother turns to the child and just starts screaming at her. Like, how do you feel? Like, are you sitting there and thinking, gee, I wonder if this is good or bad, or like right and wrong? Or do you instinctively go, ah, like, what are you
Yep.
doing? And then imagine that you see a stranger walking up to this group and, kind of scolds the mother and like, what are you doing? Stop screaming at each other. Like, this is so messed up. How do you feel about a stranger? Like, are you thinking like, oh, what a good person. I wish I'd done that. Or I'm going to go join the conversation. And so like that kind of like eek and then, ah, is a moral intuition. And in a particular kind of moral intuition, we consider this to be a moral intuition that's based on what we call a moral foundation, the moral foundation of care. And the moral foundation of care gives rise of intuitions of like, ooh, bad when we see harm and hurt being done, particularly to vulnerable and weak others. And also reactions of like pride and admiration when we see someone caring for and protecting the weak and vulnerable. So that's the care foundation. Now imagine that another situation. Imagine that a friend tells you that they did the most fun thing over the weekend. They went to an improv comedy workshop. And not only did they do that, they went with their dad because they wanted to do something interesting and different with their dad. And so they went to this comedy workshop and they're like, you know what? I was getting into this really bratty character And I just slapped my dad in the face as part of this comedy skit. And he like didn't mind at all. Like, do you have a reaction to that? Are you like, well, it was just like a gentle slap. The dad didn't mind. This was like comedy skit. Who cares? Or are you going like me, like, ugh, like I would never do that. That's just, I don't care that it was a comedy skit. That's just messed up. Like, I don't like it. So that feeling of like, ugh, I don't like it could be arising due to another moral foundations that we call authority. Authority, respect, moral foundation that makes us sensitive to social hierarchies, and caring about the importance of expecting your elders, respecting your leaders, respecting established cultural like norms that maintain order, stability, traditions, institutions, and laws. So that's the authority one. Another one that we discovered in our research was that let's say you're at a dinner with friends and they're complaining about their neighbors. They're in this bitter conflict with their neighbors. They are pissed, they are venting, they want your validation. But you find yourself agreeing internally with the neighbors. In fact, you think your friends are being totally unfair, totally unreasonable. And so, like, what do you do? If you're feeling like a little bit of a conflict internally, like I do right now, even as I'm describing this scenario, that might be because this is pitting your fairness moral foundation, which gives rise to the sense of like, we like when things are just and equal and fair and reciprocal. And we have negative reactions when someone's like cheating or being unfair or taking advantage of others or taking more than their fair share. And so that's the fairness foundation being like, my friends are being totally unreasonable. This is totally unfair. But also, they're your friends. You don't care about the neighbors. You don't know the neighbors at all. So if you're kind of feeling like you really want to take your friend's side as well, that might be the loyalty moral foundation, which gives rise to intuitions around, really being part of the group, being part of the tribe, sort of self-sacrificing for the group, patriotism, like things that just really put your in-group, including your friends, sort of above others in some way or give them more moral regard. So that's the loyalty and the fairness foundations. And then we have two more, which is the best example I've seen is maybe you're walking down the street and you see someone and they're just tattooed head to toe. And they have at least 50 piercings that you can see, not a square inch of skin is visible, and they have these metal spikes embedded in their hair. Now, a lot of us might see someone like that and be like, wow, like this is really unusual and kind of weird. More kudos to them. People can do whatever they want with their bodies. I'm glad that they're self-expressing. If you have that reaction, probably in you, the autonomy moral foundation is stronger. And the autonomy moral foundation, it kind of like really gives a sense of like people should be free to do what they want, and oppression and tyranny is bad. Like anyone trying to constrain you. On the other hand, if you're sort of like, I can't put my finger on it, but it just feels icky and weird. Like, I don't know why. It's just like, I don't know, it's just wrong. That's just like too much. If you have that reaction, that might be due to the sanctity moral foundation, which makes us feel like certain things, like the body or the planet, are sacred and special and need to be treated in this special kind of way. And it's not just about like kind of self-expression, but it's also about this like body as a temple idea. So I know this was kind of long, but I really wanted to help you volunteers also get a sense of what's going to be in the
Exactly what we want. Yeah, keep going.
yeah. So that's how we ended up with these like six foundations. Originally there were five, then we sort of discovered in the data the autonomy one. So again, to recap, we have care, fairness, in-group loyalty, respect for authority, autonomy, and sanctity.
Excellent. Yeah, well, and I know at this point in the chat, if people want to even kind of share what's standing out for you as far as the ones that are most kind of powerful or important for you, as you've heard Dr. Koleva express, please let us know. And would you be up for just kind of sharing a little bit more background around the origin story of how your morals came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So if this all sounds like, what is she talking about? This is weird and interesting. You can find out what your moral foundations are strongest and how that compares to other people that have filled out this questionnaire that we use to assess those at your morals. Your morals was created. So a year after the conference where I saw John talk about moral foundations theory for the first time, this point we'd been in communication, we lived in different coasts. We got together in the proverbial conference lobby, hotel lobby bar. And we're there meeting with them, my advisor and I, John and his graduate student, Jesse, and this other graduate student, Ravi, who had previously had a career in computer science, which is not common for psychologists. And we're talking about how we want to study the theory and what we want to do and collect data. He goes, you know what? I can code up a quick website and we're going to put up the questionnaire and then we can send the link to people and they can fill out the survey. And we were like, wouldn't it be amazing if we can get like 1,000 people to fill out the survey? And then John wrote a paper, so we did that. And then John wrote a paper that was published in Science, which got a lot of attention. The New York Times posted about that study and then posted about morality generally. There was an article which also included the link. So suddenly that day we got 25,000 people, servers are crashing, craziness ensues. But I think at this point, when I stopped working on, I'm not currently maintaining and part of the team that runs the site. We had to hand it off to someone because we all got busy with our things. We have millions and millions and millions and millions of people who have filled it out all over the world and have generated hundreds and hundreds of papers using the data. And the interesting thing I want to highlight is that it's not just selfish, like one way, we just want you data, answer another quiz on the internet. We really wanted to teach people about psychology. So once you fill out a questionnaire, we will tell you what it's about, what theory it's about, how your answer compares to that of other people who filled it out, what are the hypotheses, and sometimes we will link papers that you can go and read. So it's really like a two-way, like you give us your data and we'll give you understanding of yourself and your morals and your psychology.
I mean, I love it, right? Distributed input and a chance to really learn across the country live time. One thing I'm even seeing and being reminded of here in our discussion in the chat is that several of our conservative outreach directors, our conservative caucus leaders have been using yourmorals.org for years. That is, really one of the first ways that I heard about it actually through the work of Jim Tolbert. And it's certainly been relevant for our work here in CCL already. We're really looking forward to continuing to roll it out and broaden the awareness. And I guess from your perspective, Dr. Koleva, what would you say, especially knowing what you know about Citizens Climate Lobby, why does moral foundations theory matter to the work that we do? And, a second part, if you can remember, you can build this in a little bit later on. What's exciting to you still about moral framing?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think the main thing for me, and I remember distinctly, so many years ago, what I thought of when I was listening to John first talk about it is, oh my God, this is why good people disagree. Because, at the time, the so-called cultural wars in the US were raging, and it just seemed like it just wasn't satisfying to be like, oh, people who disagree with me are just stupid and evil. Like they just don't get it. And it's like, that just it just doesn't feel true. And so what we find that because, as I was even demonstrating earlier, people might have different intuitions to the exact same scenario. They might think this is totally fine or like, eh. And so now you can start to understand why these people, why completely reasonable people that are otherwise very similar are going to disagree. And we also find that you can take the exact same message and frame it to speak to those different foundations differently and increase persuasion and so an increased buy-in. And so it's powerful for framing as well as powerful understanding individuals. So you can talk about climate change and, particularly as you said, what does that relate to our work? You can talk about climate change and problems and potential solutions in terms of facts and statistics and so forth, or personal self-interest, or you can talk about them in terms of shared values or things that people deeply care about. So you can talk about how climate change worsens children's allergies. Like, do you feel how that's different than saying CO2 emissions went up by this much last year and, in this part of the country? It's like, okay, I guess that's bad. So I want to share, does that kind of make sense?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, please continue to elaborate, but this has been super instructive so far.
Great. So I want to then share a little bit, something like very concrete. And the reason why we're saying, why am I still interested? I'm still interested because research continues to kind of point to morality generally, psychology generally, and moral foundations in particular being very useful tools. And so, initially we could kind of like had these hypotheses. There were some papers, but any one study is limited. And what excites me is that bigger and better studies or like more comprehensive, more in the real world are coming out. So one that I came across that I wanted to tell you about this was from 2 years ago. This study surveyed 60,000 people in 23 countries, which were taken to be representative of that country. So this represented 70% of the world's population. And what they asked people is to, their opinion on various statements. One of the statements was, it is essential that our government does whatever it takes to limit the effects of climate change. And only 10% of people disagreed across, 60,000 people in 23 countries. So there's this broad agreement that climate change is a problem and governments need to do something. But when people were asked their opinions on specific policies, support suddenly started to vary. So it's really the devil's in the details. And so what this study did is they took 18 different climate policies and framed them in different ways. Some of them were framed in moral terms, and some of them were framed more like this is about economic opportunity, this is about extreme weather events, but also like health hazards, which starts to veer into values and generational responsibility. And what they found was that across countries, demographics, and political orientations, the message that had this generational framing was 12 times more effective. And the generational framing was we have a responsibility towards the next generation to leave the planet in a good state. And it's like 12 times more effective. We rarely see effects that strong in psychology
No
research.
kidding.
So when you see something like that, you're like, okay, words really matter. And a quote I really like from that paper is the data says that fear versus hope is really the wrong debate. The big motivator is protecting what we love. It's the combination of people's love for their children and their world and their sense of impending loss that drives their desire for a different and better future for the world. This is the bigger narrative that can lift support across countries and segments. So you hear something like that, like, oh, this is really exciting, here's one frame, but I can't possibly frame every message, in terms of the children. So it's like, and also this was just people answering surveys, kind of like talking about their opinions. But like, we all know that what we say and what we do sometimes is different, and especially when it comes to climate change, because it's really hard to change your behavior. It's hard to use less electricity. It's just hard. As I learned when I was the director of research at Sea Change, we focused largely on behavioral interventions for reducing energy usage. And so this other study that literally just came out 2 months ago in Nature Climate Change, obviously a very prestigious journal, was looking at using moral foundations theory, again, to frame messages and using an app and tracking people for 8 weeks. So people were answering questions, 156 adults in the UK, using this bespoke app for 8 weeks, and they were recording their daily behaviors in 6 domains: electricity usage, driving, flying, heating, like using the heat, diet, specifically whether they ate meat and dairy, and consumption, like buying goods other than food. And that was converted into CO2 emissions. They also tracked their daily civic and political climate action behaviors. So they asked them about that in their little like daily quiz. And they split the group in two, and half of the people they were in the experimental condition, they got a little moral appeal based on the moral foundations. So one example of a moral appeal was, if we take action on climate change, it will send a powerful signal to our children and grandchildren that we care about their future and are willing to make sacrifices for them. So once again, they used the children, but they also had other framing relative to the other moral foundations. And everyone else just filled out the survey every day. So there's no message. They're just reporting on their CO2 related behaviors and whether they engaged in climate change action and behaviors. And what they found was that people who got this messaging, this moral messaging, reported a significant change in their use of heat, in their heating, borderline changes in diet behavior and consumption as well. And that they also reported increased civic and political action. And this was especially true for people that were center and right-leaning, as opposed to left-leaning, which I thought was very interesting. But what they also found was that there was backlash amongst people who had strongly espoused egotistic values. So there was like this, they're hearing this moral message, but they're really kind of self-serving, which they knew from a bunch of questionnaires they had given them at the start of the study. Those people were like, I'm going to do what I want. And they did the thing like even more. So it's not like it's a magic wand tool that works always. But it works better for most people because thankfully most people do not hold strong egotistic values. Most people
Yeah,
are.
that is definitely just a really helpful window into the power, as well as kind of the limitations, or I guess the narrow prescription, strategic importance of framing. And I know I'm seeing even here in the Q&A already about, wanting to dive more into that framing piece. But
Mhm.
Before anything else, I've got a couple of other questions and then we'll go to Q&A probably in another 10, 15. Can you kind of explain a little bit more? You just kind of mentioned about some of the strengths and limitations, like unpack a little bit more about the caveats, would you say, or like where is it most effective? Give us a little bit more of an update on that.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's one we're still very much unpacking. The research is still actively trying to figure out. Okay, we know that morality works, we know that moral framing works, moral foundation framing works, but what works exactly for whom, when, under what circumstances? And so one caveat is that as psychologists, we really want to think that it's all about psychology. And it's all about individuals. We study psychology at the individual level. And so a lot of research is looking at like, how does this one message change this one person's opinion or behavior? But of course, like climate-related behaviors are structural too. In fact, in the study that I just cited, they didn't find effects of the moral messaging on flying and driving. And that's because, like, it doesn't matter how much I care about the planet. When I want to see my parents who live in San Diego, I'm probably going to fly. Like, I'm probably not going to drive. And just don't have another option. And maybe I'll limit the number of times I fly, or I'll buy some kind of carbon offsets. But, it's a lot harder than to just like put on a sweater instead of turning on the heat or open the window. So, one thing to think about is like how much agency does a person have, and also structural things like kind of like what are people around me doing? So there was a study that I want to mention I thought was really interesting. A lot of the individual level research was showing that care and fairness, like I was giving these examples about protecting the children, and we have a responsibility, that care and fairness messaging works best. But what these researchers did is they looked at CO2 emissions at the county level and values espoused at the county level. And the reason why we knew that is because of your morals collects data from all over the country. So we could sort of see like, okay, people in the zip code, people tell us their zip codes too. We can sort of map zip codes to values to CO2 emissions data. And what they found is that counties that were strong on care and on in-group had less CO2 emissions. And so we kind of see different foundations playing at the individual level than at the county level. So if you're developing a message that's going like on TV for an entire like region, that might be different. What would work might be different than if you were just talking to your neighbor and trying to convince them to like abandon their gas guzzling SUV and get an electric. So that's another caveat, like the different levels of explanation for different levels of the messaging. I mean, I could go on with caveats, but those are probably the big ones that come to mind.
I mean, that's incredibly instructive already. And again, just points to the value of what yourmorals.org has been able to provide, having that real world research county by county across the country. I mean, and we get to tap into that too and, be a part of kind of further research as well. I think people are very excited to hear about it. I'm going to open it up for Q&A in just a little bit, but what I'd love to do, I guess, first and foremost, is just have the chance to also ask you too here, Dr. Koleva, if you could give one piece of advice to citizen advocates across the country really trying to create a moral connection across differences, what would that be?
It's like asking me to have just one potato chip bread. It's really hard.
Well, you can give a couple. It doesn't have to be one.
I would say, in general, not even just using moral foundations in particular, but just use language that speaks to the personal, the emotional, the value laden, and less about facts and statistics, which can sort of kind of like go over people's heads. Tell a story. If you can tell a story about something related to the policy you're talking about, or tell a story about the people that are going to be impacted by it. Humans, we're designed to respond to the personal and the story and emotional. And then I'm going to allow myself a second one, which is to know your audience. You alluded to that earlier. To the extent that you can find out what the person you're trying to convince cares about. And sometimes you can do that in personal communications, but if you're writing to a member of Congress, see what they talk about, especially when it's off the cuff and not some like super scripted message, in an ad campaign or even at the campaign, and see what they say in town hall meetings and try to suss out like what's important to them. What do they care about? What are they really worried about? When you talk to people, like ask them, like, if you could protect one thing, what would it be? And so then you get a sense of sort of like their moral foundations and their like deep personally held beliefs and values, and then tailor your message to speak to that.
I love that open-ended question. We're definitely practitioners of that in our own meetings, and just taking that on, if you could protect one thing, what would it be? I think it's a great insight. If you're okay with it, I think we have a good, 20 minutes to be able to jump into a lot of the questions that we have here in the discussion. Is there anything that you'd like to share, I guess, before that?
No, I cannot see the chat and I'm dying to see what's in there.
Okay, all right. Well, let me jump into it then here. So I'm going to combine a couple of these ones that are most upvoted, and that is just to kind of, for us listening in, if you can just give us a broad overview again of the six moral foundation elements, and then, do those in that might identify as more liberal or conservative, typically score differently in those different areas.
Yeah, the research originally shows that, liberals primarily draw their moral intuitions on the care and fairness foundations. So, if it doesn't hurt anyone and it's not, unfair and disadvantaging some group over another, then it's fine. But, it's not that they didn't have the other foundations, but they were just much less strong. Versus conservatives care about all of them. And so, when this was really relevant at the time, um, same-sex marriage was a big issue. And a lot of, my liberal friends and my liberal, academic collaborators, we would just be like, why do people care? Like, shouldn't everyone have the right to marry? And, like this is so damaging, to people's relationships and to their ability to have access to the same, benefits. And then the more conservative side will talk about how this threatens the traditional institution of marriage and it threatens society. And the two sides would just like stare at each other and be like, I just don't like, what are you talking about? And so we see this difference and we see it not just in the US. We see it as a general difference in other countries between the more progressive and the more traditional sort of political parties. Of course, this is different in more than two-party systems, and of course, these are generalizations. But yeah, the foundations of loyalty, authority, and sanctity appear to be higher amongst conservatives than amongst liberals.
And the great thing is, you go to that website and you can find your own value mix, and that will be part of our training to really understand each of our own individual experiences before trying to even project that or, understand others. So here's another helpful question, I guess, for you to unpack from Wharton here. And the question really, is directed at given the challenge of politically motivated framing, which feels, to many like we're being painted into a corner if we are bringing up the words climate change, before even, appealing to one's moral foundations, being, in this setting, Wharton asks, it's frustrating that before they will actually hear your moral appeal about climate, you need to put aside your reflex to dismiss that entirely. Does this teaching of moral foundation framing give us any guidance on that?
On like not to get dismissed.
Yeah, yeah. Like how best to kind of bring up a conversation on climate change in your mind.
Yeah, I think honestly at this point, I mean, it's hard. Just let me just recognize that it is difficult. It's a lot of issues are and especially in the US, things have become so almost too moralized that if you just so much as say something that might disagree, even with your own tribe, you will get immediately ostracized. And that's true for both sides. And so the issues are hot and it's hard. But I would say, particularly even using the phrase climate change can be like, kind of activating for people. And so to the extent that it's possible, like really focusing on, and as I mentioned, the specific policies and the specific proposed solutions. Like, how do you feel about carbon tax? Well, the word tax is not, that has its own, but, asking companies to pay a little bit more when their policy, when their practices are polluting the rivers. Like, notice how I didn't say anything about climate change, or I guess that's not, but like it's not maybe not the best example because it's not about rising emissions, but kind of try to speak to the specific and then kind of like stay away from these labels that are going to freak people out.
And I think this builds into the next most upvoted question here from Martha, and that is, do you have recommendations on how to use moral framing without it feeling shaming?
Oh, I love this question so much. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting because when moral foundations theory and this supporting studies first came out, everyone got so excited about the political differences because it could help us understand each other better. But at the end of the day, like everyone has the six moral foundations. We're a lot more similar than we're different. And when we look at differences, they're small relative to the individual differences. And so like you all can think of many, many examples in your daily life you start paying attention to where you had, the opposite side's moral intuition. And so without shaming people, you're just trying to figure out what people care about. And at that level, most people care about the same things, like because the foundations are universal. We find these in every country that we've studied, and we've studied almost all countries at this point because of data from your morals is international. So we're more similar than we're different. And there's no reason to shame because you too have, I mean, generally, my liberal friends don't believe in it. They're like, question authority, right? There's the bumper sticker. And then I give them the slapping your father example, and they're like, oh, that's just, ugh, And so it's like, we all have these reactions. There's no reason to shame someone or guilt someone.
I think that's key, right? And that really is the core to diving into this, understanding the framing, helping use it then to build out a sense of common ground that we can build from, speaking about shared values from it. So here's one also that's going to be kind of a couple of actually that are exploring different moral foundations and how they interact with things. One of which is there a moral foundation regarding how we relate to the world, or the natural world, rather?
I mean, all of them could be. So the foundations are not because of framing, right? So, to some extent, the in-group foundation comes to mind. But it's kind of like, is the whole world your in-group? Are people on your continent your in-group? Are people in your country? With social media and with the internet, I might feel more kinship with someone living across the planet from me. So is it my, Reddit group? It's like what is community has changed so much because we're so interconnected. And so that means that you're gonna extend that like in-group intuition about like loyalty to your team is gonna vary now a lot more than before. And so that relates to kind of like people caring about the whole world. Some people have this enormous circle of moral regard, and they just see everyone as part of the same in-group. It's us versus aliens or something. Um, so that's one that comes to mind, but you could frame any, like when we talk about rising sea levels across the planet from us, now we're talking about the harm being done, to coastal villages, to their livelihoods and their children, you know, so and the species. So anything could give a rise to a moral intuition across all of them.
This next one here from Travis in the upvotes is a great one. It's actually one that I know as we're building out the curriculum, we feature very prominently. And that is ask Sena about Jonathan Haidt's analogy of the elephant and the rider. It speaks directly to how people make decisions. The elephant is in charge, but the rider thinks they are.
Yeah, this is it's relates to that initial. The reason why I gave all these examples in the beginning is because I was trying to illustrate how you know if something is giving you an ick, like instantly. You're not sitting there conceptualizing things and thinking like, oh, gee, I have a strongly held value that parents shouldn't scream at their children because that would produce, negative emotional consequences in the child and damage the relationship. Like you're not. But if I ask you, oh, I thought I saw an ick in there. What was that about? You're gonna produce exactly that. You're gonna produce some answer that is gonna bring in some rational arguments and rational concerns, and you're gonna tell a very convincing, logically sounding story that justifies, your reaction of like, ugh. So John is saying um, it's not about cognition and like the mind, and it's really more these like gut reactions of right and wrong and emotion, and which is much fuzzier, much harder to measure, much harder to talk about. Like you just have an ick. Sometimes you don't know why, especially when it comes around issues of sanctity violations, where at least in the US, we don't talk so much about physical pollution, but in India, for example, they have very strongly elaborated notions about how you treat the body and touching and contamination and all that. So sometimes you just have an ick and you can't explain it using your socially constructed language of right and wrong. That it depends on where you live.
And I think it is fascinating when you think about the elephant and the rider and both of them kind of moving forward, how much it is in our own experience in our own lives. We tend to project our own thoughts as if we are making decisions fully rationally, and we aren't kind of noticing that subtle subconscious or initial kind of emotional influence. And I think that's a really useful metaphor to helping keep in mind that as much as we might like to think that we're all the rider all the time, there's a lot of elephant in us.
Yeah, we're most, in fact, yeah, we're mostly elephants if you look at the relative size.
Well, this builds. I've got a couple of questions here in our Q&A that are kind of aligned around the faith kind of angle that you've already kind of unpacked a little bit. Jay writes, I see the six moral foundations are closely aligned with many faith traditions, such as the Catholic social teachings, Laudato Si, around its calls for ecology through dialogue, mutual listing. What are your thoughts on how this approach and framing, can we really practice to be, connected with faith traditions and building on that? There's another question around, what suggestions you have for engaging with those that do come from a strong faith background with moral framing or foundations in mind.
Um, I'm not an expert on sort of like different religious traditions and how we could speak to people that are in those traditions. Most of the research that I've seen is kind of this more, um, I believe it's like kind of comes from maybe the Protestant tradition around being stewards of the earth. Uh, and I'm sorry, I'm not Protestant, so I'm not familiar, but that I've seen that being used as, the planet as a sacred object and humans having a responsibility to it as stewards of the earth. We've seen that kind of framing to be effective, more effective among religious audiences and particularly, among Christian Protestant audiences. I would expect that other religions and sub-religions that really emphasize that belief to also respond more positively to it. So there are ways to use the Sanctity Foundation, and to the extent that the sanctity is about the spiritual, the kind of noble, if you will, sort of a more elevated sense of right and like a sense of right and wrong that is kind of above the human level.
Yes, yeah, and I think that really speaks again to the importance of with CCL here, we have many different action teams, and several of them are aligned around different faith practices or communities, and really using this, in the future to help us understand what has been helpful for that particular perspective or faith tradition, denomination, you name it. We look forward to being a part of deepening that understanding as well. This next one here comes from Skip, and the question is, have you found that it's important and effective to initially frame questions in building a moral relationship that help to understand biases that might be deeper than more surface social biases?
Well, it's hard to, if you're simultaneously framing things and trying to understand the other person, those are kind of at odds. So before you frame things, you want to first understand the person so that you know what framing is going to speak to them, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So first you try to understand exactly those kind of deeply held beliefs, and that's difficult. You kind of need a conversation. You need to look around and see the context that they're in. As I was speaking earlier about contextual factors, you want to understand, what is the predominant economic issue in their county? Like what is threatening their job? What is threatening their local park? Like, do they even have a local park? Do they have any connection to nature? Is there any nature near them? And what's determining their diet? Maybe they want to eat healthy greens, but there isn't a grocery store that has fresh produce anywhere near them. So yeah, they are eating burgers at McDonald's. Nothing against McDonald's, but sort of you try to understand the person and you try to understand what they care about, and then you frame. Then you try to persuade them. You connect first. You understand first. Um, and you watch for that ick. This is the other thing. How do you understand those deeply held beliefs and biases? Is you watch people's facial reactions. People might be saying like, I guess that's fine. Like, is it fine? You know what I mean? We're so good. We are so good. Your partner is mad at you, even though they're denying it. and usually 15 minutes before they've said anything. You know your child is upset before they've said anything. So we can read those, especially with moral intuitions. You can detect the like, and the ick. So they're talking, but you watch what their faces are doing. Watch if their shoulders are down. Like watch if they're in a protective stance. And if they're in a protective stance, just be like, we're on the same team here. We're all like wanting things to be feel good and safe and um, you know, like just taken care of. We all just want to be taken care of and take care of each other.
Yes, I think that is so powerful. And I think the importance that you've also highlighted of being able to put this into practice in your own life with your own friends, your partner, your family, having the chance to not just kind of jump into a conversation maybe with your member of Congress with that first chance to try these questions out, I think is key and really, detecting those reactions on the
The
more
Thanksgiving table, it's coming up. You're gonna get together with relatives at Thanksgiving, and some of them might disagree with you politically. Just try that. Try bringing up an issue in the language that you think you might speak to them and see what happens. Experiment.
Yes, we actually have our communications activity this month is just about that.
Ah!
I know we only have a couple of time for a couple more questions here. One thing that I did see in the chat here I thought was really powerful, so I'll just surface this. Andy shares for the question around, yes, we all care about the future, but God will take care of it. My favorite quote he writes is to respond back with Mother Teresa, God has no hands but our hands, no feet but our feet. So really just emphasizing kind of that shared
Oh,
responsibility. Thanks for naming that, Andy. Here's
I
here's a
love
couple
that.
of questions about just like are moral foundations static? Are there, what does the research say around in our life? Do we evolve, change, see fluctuation in kind of our values? How would you kind of speak to that?
I don't know when I I want to. I looked for research on this, and I didn't see anything that was definitive or recent. I think we don't know yet because we need longitudinal studies. I think we don't, theoretically speaking, we don't expect them to change because they're innate. So it's kind of like that's the makeup that you have. It is also culturally created, but that tends to form like those sense of like identities and like sort of moral and cultural messaging is comes into your head when you're little. What I think might so my sensitivity to let's say a fairness violations and fairness virtues might not change over time, but what might change is certain issues are going to become moralized. So at first I was like, I don't know why people are talking about genetically modified crops. Is that like bad? Like what is my team? What does my political team think? So now my political team is talking about it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's bad. Let me look at the research. And I look at the research and I'm like, oh, it's really confusing. Some is bad, some is good. We don't really know. Now I don't know what to think. But you know what? My friends think it's bad. So over time, I might develop an ick to it. And I probably now, in fact, do. Now I'm just like, ugh. But I didn't at first. So issues can become moralized and they can recruit moral foundations over time. And that's probably what you really care about, not whether my sort of whatever baseline sensitivity to fairness is what it is. Um, but how I view a certain issue is malleable, which is why framing matters. That's the hope. We're like, okay, we can change people, but we can change how they perceive a certain issues, how we talk about it and how they view it, what foundations they view it in terms of.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful framing. Again, thinking about the impact of each of us and the roles that we can play in our own lives. And I think that ties perfectly. A couple of our most, we've actually gotten through a lot of these great questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for asking them. And thank you again, Dr. Koleva, for being available to speak so many of these rapid fire. As you know, we're getting ready next week to have over 250 meetings, virtually with members of Congress. And a couple of these questions that I still have left are really themed around preparing or thinking about applying, more foundations theory to our preparations. If you're all right, I'll just ask a couple more of these to see if you have any wisdom, and it's entirely all right to say, I don't know. But one of them is, based on your research in moral psychology, which values most strongly influence people's willingness to adopt clean energy or to support, energy infrastructure improvements? Are there any, particular values that you would highlight within that?
This is where it's tricky. This is where we get to that at the individual level. We have seen care and fairness to be very effective. But that county study was showing that counties that are high on in-group have like fewer emissions. So um, because so the simple answer is go with the ones that are more common. So like the care and fairness are the ones that are shared. I mean, they're all shared. But if you are talking with a liberal member of Congress or you're messaging with them, then that's like a kind of a good bet. Um, if but if you're trying to convince someone that's more on the right, maybe also bringing the other three moral foundations. But really what's going to work best is the personalized approach, which takes more work. But what we see in the research is that it's tailoring your message, your moral message to their moral concerns. And there's a number of studies. One comes to mind that looked at that we took the transcribed speeches of members of Congress and then coded them using this tool that we developed, the Moral Foundations Dictionary. So like certain words like patriotism, or respect, or hierarchy or tradition, like those are like, okay, in group and authority. And so you could sort of code the member of Congress moral foundation according to how they talk. So like look at a couple of speeches of the people that you're trying to convince. Look at how they're talking and see if you can highlight, okay, this is talking about good and bad and emotion. Let's see what's here.
And the great news is in Bridge, we are absolutely doing that in part two for knowing your audience and the recommendation of really being able to look at speeches, look at those primary data sources to help kind of understand some of what we're unpacking here and reviewing with part one. So I think that's great advice. And I see we have time for only one last question. I've been saving this one because I think it's a perfectly asked one here from our volunteer bank. And Sarah asks, in deeply polarized times, what would you say helps you stay hopeful about the power of dialogue and shared values?
Staying hopeful. I mean, wait, all the recent research that shows that framing works is, this. I was really excited when I saw the Nature study because, yes, it was done over 8 weeks. It's rare that we have an opportunity to message someone, for 8 weeks. But the fact that that study showed actual behavioral change, it was self-reported. So like, did people lie? Probably in both groups. So the control group didn't show that effect. So it's not just self-report. Something like that when I'm like, okay, we're not just like talking opinions here. We're talking about behavior. We can see it in very rigorously done studies. It makes me hopeful that our words matter, like how we talk about things matter, and we can control that. Um, and for actions that, as I mentioned, heating, diet, things that are less contextually and structurally constrained, we can see a movement on those. That's really exciting because at first it was like, these are all just theories. It's, really cool that people differ and we can measure them in your morals, but like, what does it actually mean for the real world behavior? So now that we have these more behavioral studies, I'm like, wow, it really is working. So
I love hearing that.
that's exciting. We have power. I think with climate change, it's just like powerlessness. Not only are you powerless to the giant problem, but you're powerless to convince people because it's so polarized. You can end up sort of feeling like, oh, I'm tired of beating my head against the wall. And so this research is like, yeah, there's things that work.
I think those are definitely powerful words to really center ourselves on in our own role in activation of making that happen. Thank you so much, Dr. Koleva, for being available today, for your wisdom, for your input to helping us frame this curriculum. And I know I speak for all of our attendees on the line how much this has really been a helpful conversation. So have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank
And
you for
for all of
having me.
us that are here, we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then jump back into our final big panel of the day, growing relationships with how volunteers build trust within their lawmakers. Thanks again so much, Dr. Koleva.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.